In this video, we talk about architects, gardeners and magpies, and which one you may be. In a recent White Dwarf article, there's an interesting piece by Phil Kelly about the different ways in which we all build and grow our armies, and it struck a note with myself, and I wanted to do a quick video on it as I definitely fell firmly into one of Phil's categories. Phil calls out 3 areas in which we as army builders and collectors may sit. Firstly, the architect. The approach is best summarised and typified by those players who work out theoretical armour lists before investing in their practical equivalent. Maybe even playtesting their army through the use of proxy models. Once fine-tuned and happy, they'll often buy the lot in one go and complete the army in terms of a production line blitz once the models land on their hobby table. Secondly, the gardener. Organic in approach, especially compared to that of the architect, going with their gut instinct rather than a fine-tuned plan, leading to a plethora of fun experiments and diversions, often spurred on by an almost irresistible urge to make their current vision of coolness a reality. These collections are amassed in fits and spurts, going off the back of hobby binges, but are also hit with a reduction of pace as they await inspiration to strike once more. And last but not least, the third option, the hobby magpie. For this approach, you have to be a lot less picky about what you're planning on collecting and just go, as with the name may suggest, with whatever shiny thing you can get your hands on. Amassing the collection through acquiring items often second or even third hand, the trick here, in order to make the collection cohesive, is that you have a unifying background or paint scheme that pulls them all together. Like I mentioned, I would very much place myself into one of these buckets, and that bucket is the architect. When I first bought the first phase of models for the Screaming Eagles, I sat down with my friend and built out an effective list at the time, which was then purchased in full. This, of course, has then been built out over time, admittedly in relative restraint, but the backbone of the army is still that initial list. I also think it's fair to say that it isn't just the hobby that I'm like this with. I like to make informed decisions about almost anything, especially when it comes to spending my cold earned cash. It starts off with knowing that I want something, whether it be a new army or an electronic device such as a TV, laptop or tablet. Once I've made the decision that I want something, then comes the research. This, for me, is almost as enjoyable as having the thing itself. Sad, I know. I suddenly start researching across different sources to ensure that my ultimate decision will be the right one. For example, looking and comparing the specifications for a device may be offered by different brands, or the same brand but different model variants for each one. Next on to the reviews available, both from a professional source but also those made by normal people on Amazon, for example. I want to make sure that I'm not being swayed by some corporate attempt to taint by going off a sneaky paid article, for instance. I want to make sure that by the time I actually decide to buy a product, I know it's the right one for me. Now, of course, in terms of the hobby, it isn't as binary as whether a TV is 4K or not. There are nuances that go into buying an army. Do they play in the style you want them to play in? Do you like the lore associated with them? Are they cool models to build and paint? Maybe most importantly, do they look cool on the tabletop? It is these nuances and the sheer number of them that go into the decision-making process that probably has meant that I've not made a big army purchase for years. There are of course downsides to this data-driven thought process, and this was laid to bear with a recent FAQ errata update, which saw a number of sweeping changes for the Space Marine doctrines. Admittedly, a number of these were massively overpowered, and if you were to look at the recent ITC event results tables, it would be a rare sight not to see an Iron Hands list somewhere near the top. This led to a number of people on social media calling out the fact that the only reason they'd bought Iron Hands armies was purely on the basis of their sheer competitiveness on the tabletop. As with most competitive things, nothing is static, and these things need to change for the benefit of the overall game. So whilst competitiveness on the tabletop is certainly one of these elements that will no doubt go into the list of things to consider when building an army, you have to be cognizant that this will, by the very nature of having a balanced tabletop game, change over time. The recent flurry of releases through the Psychic Awakening has done a fantastic job at tempting me into a new purchase throughout the last couple of months. But I don't know about you guys, but whilst the hype and the build-up pre-release was certainly doing its job perfectly, once the releases were out there in the real world, they never got me quite excited enough to pull the trigger. The best example of this was the Prophecy of the Beast, which saw the announcement of 2 reimaginings of 2 classic models. First, Ragnar Blackmane, and then the absolute star of the show, Ghazghkull. Both, in my opinion, are wonderful sculpts. Ragnar with the atypical GW pose of launching himself off some conveniently placed terrain, and the sheer ferocity and power from the absolute humongous reincarnation of Ghazghkull. Prior to this whole lockdown thing, I went into GW prior to them formally announcing the box set and asked whether they thought that they would be releasing a set with this Psychic Awakening edition due to the rumours that were circulating online at the time. I mentioned that I thought it would be a nice opportunity for myself to break my usual habit of purchasing a whole army at once and would make that perfect segue step into the gaming side of things, as let's face it, that first tentative step is somewhat daunting. The manager in the store said he'd put his money on them not releasing a box set. Oh, how I wish I should have shook his hand that day. I do sometimes question whether the advice the staff in the shops give is somewhat influenced by an ulterior motive. In this case, and also in the case of the Space Marine Codex I bought all of 5 weeks prior to the one being released, that they often put the chance of an immediate sale ahead of some sound advice. Unless that's me just being a little bit sceptical. Anyway, I digress. As I mentioned, prior army purchases have been one where I've known the full army in advance and purchasing and bought in full. However, with the Prophecy of the Beast, it presented myself with an opportunity to get my hands on 2 armies I'd always been very tempted with. Looking back at the old models, name 2 more characterful armies than the ravenous Space Wolves and the weird and wacky Orcs. However, when the box set was announced, it was all a little flat. Even though the Primaris Marines do kind of look badass, they are the definition of vanilla when it comes to differentiating between legions, which, let's be honest, is a whole topic for a whole nother video. In addition to this, I also felt that the value the box provided just wasn't there. Some Phobos Armoured Marines and some Orc Boys wasn't really the useful foundation for an army going forward. Don't get me wrong, it is nice to have both Ragnar and Ghazghkull thrown in there, but I think like many others, I'll wait till they're available as standalone purchases. So once again, the hype was teed up, and then the hype quickly dissipated like the air out of a balloon. And this leads me on to my next point about why I wanted to make those tentative steps into a playable, usable army. I feel a lot of people, myself included, are somewhat put off by the barriers to entry into the hobby. The cost, the vast amounts of lore, rules, the codexes upon codexes you need, and sometimes the atmosphere in your friendly local gaming store can all be a bit overwhelming when you want to take those first steps into the gaming side of things. I'm not saying all aspects are daunting, but there is certainly that apprehensiveness around walking in and being presented with a floor-to-ceiling, wall-to-wall options that can make you take a step back and go, whoa. With that being said, I want to reference here a recent Tabletop Minions video where Uncle Atten discusses the topic of an escalation league, a concept which is proving to be more and more popular within local gaming clubs and circuits. The way an escalation league was explained, which I was grateful for as I'd never heard of one, was that you start off small and incrementally you build up your army over time, using the growing army in a league setting rather than in a one-off tournament. This, of course, is good from several perspectives. Firstly, from a capital expenditure perspective, this allows for the gradual build of an army rather than buying it all in one go. Given that the entry cost for our hobby is generally very high compared to others, so much so that I know personally that it's put off a number of friends joining the hobby, any lowering or removal of this barrier is nothing but a good thing. Secondly, it also allows you to learn the nuances of how your army plays and what is and isn't so effective on the tabletop, thus ensuring that the next increment of purchase is informed and should ultimately allow for the army that plays in the way that you want it to play. So, by the time you have a 1500 to 2000 point army, it is one which not only looks the way you want it to look, but you know how to effectively manage it on the tabletop as well. Lastly, why all this sudden talk of taking the plunge into the gaming side of the hobby in the first place? Well, as I'm sure most of my viewership are aware, but for those who aren't, there's been this new channel blow up on the YouTube scene. I'm sure most of you have guessed it already, but I am, of course, talking about Play on Tabletop. With one season of content under their belt and a second well underway, which is remarkably better than the first one. For those who don't know, these guys produce TV quality battle reports in a condensed, entertaining and easy to follow fashion, and have shown what fun can be had when gaming. The best thing is, instead of a 2-hour battle report draining the very soul out of you, and no offence to those who create such videos, these guys condense and highlight the best bits over a 40-minute segment. So, you can blame these set of talented and entertaining individuals for giving me the soon-to-be gaming bug. Anyway guys, just thought I'd cover something which really struck a chord with me this week. It'd be great to hear what bucket of collector you think you would place yourself in, and what you think of the Saga of the Beast and the Psychic Awakening in general, because I do know it has been a bit hit and miss in terms of audience reception. Anyway, thanks as always for checking out the video. If you liked it, leave a like. If you didn't, a dislike. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. And until next time, Clarky signing out.